of the National Autonomous University in Mexico, UNAM, and also a lecturer in law at ITAM, which is also in Mexico City. And Cisca specializes in constitutional law and comparative constitutional studies, and works on constitutional change, judicial structures, judicial reasoning, fundamental rights, and comparative studies of Latin American constitutionalism. And I've been wanting for a long time to have Cisca as part of the Bergen Exchanges. And we did a peak preview in Sao Paulo in December. And I'm so excited to have you here, so welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a thrill for me to finally be this Bergen Exchanges, an academic enterprise that I admire in so many ways. So thank you, everybody involved. To provide an overview about the current political, social situation in Latin America is, of course, a daunting task that can be attempted from many different paradigms of relevance. But I think independently of whether we take a more philosophic or legal or social or sociological perspective, there are three main clusters of evaluation that will be important. I will call them pillars in these remarks: the peace, non-arbitrariness, democracy, and social justice. The first pillar evaluates how a political system guarantees non-violence, trust, security, non-arbitrariness, integrity, basic autonomy. It has to do with the rule of law, understood as a notion that evaluates how power is exercised and tempered in a society in a very basic sense. The second pillar evaluates the sources of political power in society, the genesis, the who, democracy versus autocracy, and everything that we have in between. And the third pillar, social justice or social and environmental justice, would evaluate the performance of the political system in terms of well-being, distribution, equality, environmental viability, etc. Now, each of these pillars can be defined broadly or narrowly. We care cumulatively about the three, but very understandably, what we focus most our attention today is the second pillar, only because the change of tendency is so radical that, you know, we stick to that even if everything is interconnected. So before turning to Latin America, just recall, I won't go into it, but just, you know, recent scholarship is very helpful in making us, you know, and giving us the dimension of this. Quantitatively, I am sure you are familiar with the VDEM report, for instance. I'm not a specialist in these indicators, but you know, you have all these, you know, amazing in the negative sense, portrayal of how things are in the world, and qualitatively, all this scholarship on populist constitutionalism, on still authoritarianism, autocratic legalism, and similar concepts is also identifies the characteristic moods of the neo-autocracies of the day, no? And some of the things we have, you know, in this characterization is that they gain office democratically and do not stage coups that often. Now I have to rephrase, because at least they do this kind of stealth coups instead of, you know, it's a different way of gaining and being in power. They use superficially acceptable mechanisms because they are gradual, step by step. The whole is always more than the sum of the parts, and formally legal, used in respected democracies, like constitutional amendment, who can oppose constitutional amendment, I mean, and apparently low-key administrative reforms as the ones, for instance, Viktor Orban used in Hungary to completely capture the made, you know, with measures that in themselves, each of them is not outrageous. This is why notions as abusive constitutionalism, lawfare, or constitutional fraud take the center stage. Third, they weaken checks and balances, you know, the other branches, the opposed independent agencies, the capture the judiciary or co-opt, etc. So they undermine constitutionalism. They develop a majoritarian politics marked by confrontation and polarization, reinforcing hyper-presidentialism, delegitimating the opposition. So we can say they delegitimize representative democracy, only that they think they are more democratic than, you know, the partitocratic democracy that they come to replace And I look at Catalina because, Milei is kind of exemplifying once again this message that the truly authentic democracy is in them and not in the corrupt party politics they come to replace. They are anti-pluralist and often religious, so they undermine liberalism. And there are left-wing and right-wing varieties with some relevant differences, but we can therefore discuss that. Autocratization along these lines is perceptible all around in Latin America, despite the fact the situation is so bad elsewhere that now, according to the VDEM database, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second most democratic region of the world, only behind Western Europe and North America. The blue is more democracy than autocracy, the red is more autocracy than democracy. Moreover, in several Latin American countries, there are U-turns. The report says the bouncing back of democracy has occurred in Brazil. In many regional countries, there is great instability, uninterrupted trouble. I will speak more about this in the end, but it's not entirely clear that what the regional zeitgeist is. There is still an important degree of unpredictability. And it turns out that this is actually great news in the context of an extremely dire global scenario. Of course, the situation of the countries that are in the third column is very bad. It's even like strange not to imagine them in the far right only because they kind of maintain a kind of electoral mechanism of some sort of thing. Nicaragua, Ortega and Murillo have deepened repressive rule up to unthinkable limits. To be deemed an opposer, it means detention, imprisonment, and more than 600,000 Nicaraguans have fled the country from 2018. In El Salvador, just Nayib Bukele, you know him, gained office by portraying himself as the alternative to traditional corrupt parties, using new styles of political communication. His administration has been marked by gross abuse of the state of exception, destruction of judicial independence, nullification of presidential term limits. He just announced that he's going to run again for the next election. Of course, having the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court saying last year that he could run again, despite the prohibition in the Constitution to the contrary. Plain irrationality. Just remember the Bitcoin saga in Ecuador, in El Salvador. And well, he has recently built a macro prison that I am sure you have seen in the news. And the parliament that he controls has just allowed last week for the collective trial of, these people, which is, apparently Mara members or people that look like Mara members, and that will allow the conviction without presenting individual evidence of all the persons that are in these centers. In Guatemala, authoritarianism also deepened during the government of Jan Matei, and the groups that control power have launched a strategy of criminal prosecution against any potentially different contenders in the election. And again, I think these past weeks, we all saw the prosecution against Bernardo Arévalo from Movimiento Semilla, who had a good position in the first round of elections. But the Constitutional Chamber has guaranteed the participation of this movement in the second round, but things are not good. The situation is not necessarily much better in the other column, in this one, in the second one. But the recent evolution in their context is more complex. There are traces of authoritarianism all around, but in countries like Ecuador, Brazil, or Mexico, the story is certainly more complex, right? So in Ecuador, again, I don't have time to go into the details, but you know that Correa had this constitution that is innovative in many respects. It has an egalitarian drive that is interesting, but then he ended up also co-opting all the state apparatus. But then under Lenin Moreno, the process kind of, was, the institutional mechanisms were used to reverse this trend. And well, now, there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of political violence, but again, the situation is bad, but at least we had a change of game at some point. In Brazil, I won't go into that. Most of the audience I see have know a lot of and study Brazil. But again, even if he ended, he spent months saying he wouldn't respect the results and attacking the electoral authorities, and even if after the election he blocked the roads of the country and assaulted physically Congress and the Supreme Court, finally, he had to leave. I mean, there's this thing. And in Mexico, you know, Andrés Manuel López Obrador ran on a lefty platform only to deploy once in power policies that are at the odds of progressivism. But again, I would say that they can be a turn in Mexico. You know, it's not clear that democracy will end anytime soon in Mexico, and the next administration could be very different. As a constitutionalist, the obvious question for me to formulate is how these new political trends interact with the gains and the shortcomings of Latin American constitutionalism as they have developed in the course of the last 2 or 3 decades. Because after all, it's not the first time that Latin America confronts these trends. You know, while mature democracies are asking themselves how to confront this, what they should do. Well, in Latin America, it turns out we already, oh, what happened to this? I know. It's okay. It's black. No, okay. Now, in Latin America, we also had this constitution that tried to speak to these problems. Well, I am just, you know, refreshing you with the extraordinary amount of scholarship made by people in this room about the traits of Latin American contemporary constitutionalism. My hypothesis, and you know, I studied recently a bit this in the Mexican situation. My hypothesis is that Latin American constitutions have been of help in making the ultimate concentration of power less easy for neo-authoritarian leaders, and in supporting the kind of social mobilization around courts, but also beyond, that has contributed a bit to slow down retrogression and that leaves space for some U-turns, propitiating spaces of resistance that with time can boost some kind of democratic reinvigoration. But I also found that even if the signature feature of contemporary constitutionalism do make a difference, they fight all these features, all we have been using up to now, they fight erosion in a relatively ineffective way because most of them are exclusively reactive or ex post, so they overcharge the judiciary. So we have, I mean, I don't have time to go into detail, but I think a more effective systemic prevention of democratic erosion would require the device of new preventive solution, both in the domain of rights and in the domain of organization of powers. And you know, in an article that by Rose Ackerman and Andres Melgar, they arrive at similar conclusions after looking into what Latin American constitutions offer in terms of moderation of hybrid presidential executive policymaking. But again, everything is very ex post and not systemic enough. In any case, and this is the last point in my 1.5 minutes that I have, in any case, I think that even if there is, this is the Rose Ackerman inventory that is very useful in terms of design, but I won't go into it. Even if there is some hope in Latin America with respect to the second pillar, I think the joy will not take us very far in view of the cracks that exist in the other 2 pillars, peace and social justice. And leaving aside now questions of social justice, whose relationship with democracy, of course, have been a topic of permanent attention in Latin America, let me draw your attention to the situation of Latin America in terms of violence, in terms of the first pillar, in terms of the basic conditions for peace, preservation of life, protection against arbitrariness, etc. Unbridled violence is inundating every inch of public and much of private life in the region. A mere sight again at the news these last months is just breathtaking, you know. Just remind the problems in Colombia, we know with the territory again, with the peace, social peace that can't, I mean, Mexico is a necro-state. The political violence again in Ecuador has been just. So in my view, we should, this is the invitation I do in this audience to close. I think the revival of rule of law debates in the wake of neo-autocratism should animate us to try to make progress around these problems, the first pillar problems, in a very specific way. In Latin America, the patterns of power allocation and distribution, the discontinuity of state presence, the interaction between public and private power, the place of law among competing sources of of normativity have been extensively studied, and yet our toolkit against violence and arbitrariness continues to be dominated by what Martin Krieger calls the anatomical conception of the rule of law, the laundry list conception, centered on the production and administration of legal norms at the official legal venues. And we embrace a basically legal conception of the rule of law, when the fact is that the prevention of arbitrariness and the tempering of power may require means to be found well beyond institution practices and traditions of, attached to the law. We must go to this wider social legal panorama that has been so studied in such a sophisticated way in Latin America. So the organizers of this panel ask us to identify spaces for resistance, opportunity, reimagination. I think Latin America can make a great contribution to this very much exercise of reimagination against around the rule of law and the Hobbesian first pillar kind of problems. But for this, social legal studies, which are so sophisticated in the region, must go from just diagnosis to policy making, and the lawyers that have dominated rule of law agendas must just embrace what we learn from this other literature. And thank you. Thank you.